Good day and welcome to Sleepy Stories. I'm truly glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, I'd love to know, where in the world are you and what time is it there right now? It's a quiet comfort to imagine this story unfolding across different hours and horizons, meeting each of you exactly where you are. Now, this is a story about money, but not in the way we usually think of it. It is a story about money as an operating system, about how a powerful monarchy like the Habsburgs tried to transform distant silver mines, guarded ocean convoys, tax contracts, and fragile paper promises into something steady and dependable, enough to fund wars, maintain governments, and hold together a global empire. And yet, again and again, the system slipped into crisis, even as shiploads of silver continued to arrive in its ports. When people speak about the Spanish Habsburg money problem, they often begin with a simple paradox. How could an empire drowning in silver keep running out of money? Tonight, we'll follow that question, slowly, carefully, and see where it leads. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish monarchy controlled the richest silver-producing zones then known to Europeans, especially in Spanish America. Yet the same monarchy repeatedly suspended payments on its debts, reorganized its credit, and struggled to meet ordinary expenses. To explain this without slogans, it helps to treat Spain not as a single state with one budget, but as a composite monarchy. A collection of kingdoms, provinces, and overseas dominions tied together by a dynasty, but divided by law, taxation, and institutions. The fiscal core was Castile, and the imperial commitments were much larger than Castile's ordinary revenues could carry. American silver did not remove that mismatch. It changed its shape. The Habsburg dynasty inherited a political geography that made financial problems almost inevitable. Under Charles I of Spain, who was also Emperor Charles V, the monarchy's commitments stretched across the Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and imperial responsibilities in Central Europe, while also expanding rapidly overseas. Under Philip II and his successors, the Spanish monarchy in practice meant a patchwork. Castile and Leon with their institutions, the crown of Aragon's realms, Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, each with their own laws and fiscal constraints. Portugal for a period after 1580, again with its own structures, and a widening set of American viceroyalties, audiencias, municipal councils, and ecclesiastical jurisdictions. The monarchy was powerful because it could draw on many territories. It was financially fragile because it could not draw on them in the same way, at the same speed, or under the same rules. Castile carried the heaviest load. Its taxes, its credit markets, and its administrative machinery became the main engine that tried to convert future income into immediate spending. That conversion was done through a set of instruments and institutions that worked well in the short term and tended to produce long-term stress. Indirect consumption taxes, negotiated extraordinary levies, the sale of offices and jurisdictions, and above all, borrowing through long-term annuities called juros and short-term loans known as asientos. These words matter because they describe different parts of a pipeline. Juros were long-term obligations issued by the crown, typically tied to specific revenue streams. They functioned like annuities. Holders bought them, and the crown promised a regular payment, funded out of an assigned tax. They could be bought and sold, and they formed a kind of domestic debt market. Many holders were Castilian institutions and individuals, towns, religious houses, and private investors seeking secure income. This was not only high finance, it was also a way for local society to park wealth in a legal claim on royal revenue. Asientos were different. These were contracts, often with merchant bankers, many of them Genoese by the later 16th century, providing large sums up front, typically to cover urgent military expenses. The crown promised repayment later, often with interest and fees, and often with collateral arrangements that might involve juros or assignments on incoming revenues. The essential point is that asientos were designed to solve a cash flow problem. The monarchy's bills came due on campaign schedules, while its revenues arrived on tax calendars and, crucially, on ocean shipping cycles. That brings the colonies into the center of the story. Spanish America did not simply send silver. It generated revenue through a complex administrative and labor system that converted ore into bullion, extracted taxes from production and movement, and then moved that bullion through guarded maritime corridors into European and international payments. Each link had limits, frictions, and delays, and those delays were precisely what made the monarchy vulnerable. Large-scale silver production took off in the mid-16th century, and two regions became especially important. In the Andes, the discovery and exploitation of Potosí in the 1540s created one of the largest mining centers in the world. In New Spain, major mining districts such as Zacatecas expanded production. Mining at this scale required more than ore and labor. It required mercury for amalgamation processes that made it possible to extract silver efficiently from certain ores. That meant another supply chain: mercury sources, transport, and controlled distribution. In the Andes, the mercury mine at Huancavelica became central. In Europe, mercury from Almadén in Spain also mattered. When mercury was scarce or disrupted, output could fall. When labor drafts were contested or transport failed, output could fall. So the silver supply was never a simple tap that could be opened at will from Madrid. The crown's fiscal relationship to this production was also layered. There was a direct claim through taxes on precious metals, famously the royal fifth in early formulations, but in practice taxation changed with time, commodity, and circumstance, and a great deal depended on enforcement capacity. The crown also gained through customs duties, sales taxes, monopoly rents on certain commodities, and fees embedded throughout the legal trade system. Yet the crown did not capture all silver, and it did not even capture all legal silver in a way that made it immediately spendable in Europe. A great deal of bullion moved as private remittances, commercial capital, and profits, and it could remain in the Americas for local transactions or be reinvested in goods. Contraband and underreporting were persistent features of a system that tried to concentrate trade through a limited number of ports and paper procedures. The administrative core of transatlantic trade was built to control and tax movement. The House of Trade in Seville, later shifting to Cadiz as practices evolved, regulated voyages, licensed ships and passengers, registered cargoes, and collected duties. The convoy system, often described as the treasure fleets, was both a security measure against privateers and rival powers and a fiscal mechanism. Concentrating departures and returns made it possible to protect ships and to concentrate inspection and taxation, but it also created periodicity. If the fleet sailed late, if it returned late, if war forced rerouting, if storms scattered ships, or if disease and shortages in port slowed loading, then the fiscal calendar in Castile did not match the expenditure calendar in Flanders, Italy, or on the seas. The monarchy could have revenue on paper and still be short of cash where soldiers needed pay. This mismatch becomes clearer when we track where money had to go. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fight wars as occasional emergencies. They maintained a strategic posture across multiple theaters. In the Mediterranean, there were long struggles against the Ottoman Empire and North African corsair networks, requiring garrisons, fleets, and subsidies. In Italy, there were major Habsburg possessions and allies to defend, requiring armies and diplomacy. In the Low Countries, the revolt that broke out in the 1560s turned into decades of war, requiring enormous and continuous expenditure. Naval warfare expanded with conflict against England and the Dutch. Even when fighting was not constant, military readiness and the costs of fortifications and logistics did not disappear. This was a financial environment in which the crown's baseline costs were high, and spikes in spending were frequent. The geography of those costs mattered. War in the Low Countries required moving men and money into a region where Spanish authority depended on cooperation with local elites and on maintaining an army at the edge of hostile territory. Paying troops was not a detail. It was a core mechanism of control. Mutinies in early modern armies were often connected to arrears, and arrears were often connected to delayed remittances. The monarchy needed reliable ways to move funds from Iberia and Italy to Northern Europe. That created an international financial circuit in which American bullion was only one part. In practice, American silver arriving in Spain was quickly drawn into a European payment system. Some of it went directly into royal finance. Much of it entered commerce and then re-emerged as taxes, loans, or purchases. The crown's borrowing was frequently arranged with merchant bankers who could advance funds in one place and be repaid in another. That mattered because soldiers in Flanders needed cash in Flanders, not in Seville. Bankers who had networks in Antwerp, Genoa, or other commercial hubs could convert Spanish promises and expected silver into immediate liquidity near the front. The crown, in effect, outsourced part of its logistical problem to financiers, transformed scattered and future revenues into present and located payments. This is where asientos became the sinews of the system. Under Philip II in particular, the crown relied heavily on Genoese financiers for large short-term loans. These contracts were not simply loans at a single interest rate. They often contained complex terms, exchange rate arrangements, fees for transfer, collateralization via juros, and repayment schedules tied to expected revenues, including silver arrivals. To the crown, the advantage was speed. To the bankers, the advantage was profit combined with collateral and political leverage. But the system had a built-in vulnerability. If revenues fell short or arrived late, or if expenditures surged beyond forecast, the crown could not meet its obligations on schedule. It then faced a choice: squeeze domestic taxes harder, sell more juros, or suspend payments on asientos and force a renegotiation. This is the operational meaning of the famous bankruptcies. In many cases, these were not total repudiations of all debt. They were suspensions or reorganizations, often focused on short-term obligations, followed by settlements that converted some claims into longer-term instruments. In the second half of the 16th century, Philip II's government declared payment suspensions more than once, most notably in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. In each case, the monarchy sought to preserve its ability to continue operating while resetting terms with lenders. A suspension could be framed as a temporary halt, while a general settlement was negotiated. The settlement might exchange some short-term claims for juros, spreading the burden across time. That could stabilize the crown's immediate cash position, but it also increased the long-term interest load and reduced future flexibility. Now the connection to the colonies becomes sharper, because American bullion was both the promise that underwrote borrowing and the revenue stream whose unpredictability could trigger a crisis. The monarchy and its lenders treated silver as a kind of gravitational center in the system. Even when loans were secured by Castilian taxes, everyone knew that the ultimate hard resource arriving from abroad was precious metal. Yet the precise flow was not entirely controllable. It depended on mine output, labor regimes, mercury, transport across mountains, security against local banditry and rival groups, bureaucratic processing, and then ocean travel under threat of storms and enemy action. In wartime, fleets could be delayed for protection. Convoys could be larger but less frequent. A single lost fleet was not merely a shipping disaster, it was a fiscal shock. It was also a political shock within Spain itself, because Castile's taxpayers and institutions were the ones asked to bridge gaps. Castile's ordinary taxes included the alcabala, a sales tax with medieval roots that was negotiated and farmed in various ways. There were customs duties and other levies, but the scale of imperial spending often required extraordinary measures. The crown negotiated services and subsidies through the Cortes of Castile, and over time these included major new burdens, such as the millones taxes introduced in the late 16th century, which were levies on consumption staples. These taxes were politically feasible only within certain limits, and the crown continually faced resistance, evasion, and the economic consequences of heavy indirect taxation. When the economy weakened, tax yields fell, which worsened the crown's finances, which encouraged more borrowing and more pressure. Here is a core mechanism that connects colony and metropolis. American silver expanded the monetary base and intensified economic change across Europe, including rising prices over the long term. Castile experienced inflationary pressures, and the crown's nominal revenues did not always keep pace with its nominal expenses, especially when military wages and supplies rose in cost. Meanwhile, the presence of silver could encourage dependence on imported goods. Much of the silver did not stay in Spain as accumulated capital. It flowed outward to pay for foreign manufactures, shipbuilding supplies, grain in bad years, and, crucially, international military expenses. This meant that even large arrivals could vanish quickly into European markets, leaving the crown again reliant on credit. The imperial structure made this more difficult because much of the crown's military spending was outside Castile. The monarchy had territories in Italy and the Low Countries that were wealthy, but their fiscal contributions were limited by local privileges and by political conditions. In the Netherlands, the very effort to centralize authority and secure more dependable revenue became one of the sources of conflict. In Aragonese realms, fiscal autonomy was strongly protected, and the crown's capacity to tax them on Castilian terms was restricted. Therefore, the monarchy's effective tax base was narrower than its strategic commitments. Spanish America, for its part, did not function as a simple treasury to be emptied at will. The crown's authority there depended on local elites, municipal councils, the church, and a bureaucracy that had to be paid and maintained. Colonial economies needed coin for everyday transactions, wages, and local trade. Retaining silver locally could be necessary for colonial stability and for the functioning of mines and markets. The crown extracted substantial revenue, but extraction was mediated by local conditions and by the fact that administration itself consumed resources. When the crown tried to increase extraction, it risked disrupting production or provoking local resistance, which could in turn reduce the long-run flow. The monarchy therefore lived inside a balancing problem: extract enough to fund European commitments, but not so much as to damage the colonial systems generating the metal. The shipping system added another layer. The convoy system was designed for protection and oversight, but it also produced bottlenecks. Concentrating legal trade into specific ports and scheduled fleets encouraged contraband through other routes. It also meant that merchants, officials, and the crown were all waiting on the same arrivals. When fleets returned, there could be sudden surges of bullion and goods that had to be processed, taxed, and distributed. The crown's creditors watched these arrivals closely because they were signals of the crown's short-term ability to pay. But a spike of arrivals could also trigger a spike of demands. Soldiers demanded arrears. Suppliers demanded payment. Bankers demanded settlement. The monarchy could appear rich and yet be immediately strained. To see how colony and metropolis formed a single financial circuit, consider how bullion turned into war finance. Silver mined in the Andes might be refined, taxed, and minted, then transported to a Pacific or Atlantic port, shipped to the Caribbean and then to Spain, registered in official channels, and then used in Seville or Cadiz to pay merchants and creditors. But a large portion would not remain as coined money in Castile. It would be used to settle international balances. Genoese and other bankers who lent to the crown often needed repayment not in Castile, but in a form they could use in international trade. If they received bullion in Spain, they could export it or use it to settle accounts in other financial centers. If they received a claim on future taxes, they could sell or discount it. The crown's debt instruments thus became commodities in European finance, and American silver was the physical foundation that gave those paper instruments credibility, until credibility broke. The repeated crises under the Spanish Habsburgs were, in this sense, repeated moments when credibility and cash flow diverged sharply. The monarchy might still have long-term revenue capacity and might still have vast territories, yet be unable to meet immediate contracted payments. When it suspended payments, it damaged trust, but it also often returned quickly to borrowing because its structural needs did not change. The same wars continued, the same garrisons needed pay, and the same sea lanes needed fleets. After settlements, lending resumed because lenders could still profit if the settlements were structured to protect them, and because the crown's fiscal base, especially in Castile, remained large enough to generate long-run repayments. Under Philip III, the pattern continued, with a major suspension in 1607. Under Philip IV, the fiscal pressure intensified with renewed conflict in the 1620s and beyond, and another major suspension occurred in 1627. In the 1640s, crises compounded as the monarchy faced revolts and wars on multiple fronts, including major internal conflicts, alongside continued external war. A major financial crisis is associated with the 1647 period. Each crisis reflected the same underlying architecture: large fixed commitments, constrained and politically negotiated revenue extraction, and dependence on short-term credit to bridge timing gaps. A closer look at taxation shows why the colonies could not solve the problem. American bullion was spectacular in scale, but the monarchy's spending was not a single item that could be covered with a single stream. It was a portfolio of continuous obligations. Castile's taxes were already heavily pledged to service juros. When the crown issued more juros or converted short-term obligations into juros, it effectively pre-spent future tax revenues. Over time, this reduced the share of annual income available for current operations because so much was assigned to debt service. When new emergencies arose, the crown had to borrow again, often at higher effective cost or under harsher terms. American silver could increase the total resources in the system, but it could not easily reverse the extent to which future revenues had already been promised away. This is one reason that tax farming and related arrangements matter in the story. Collecting taxes in early modern conditions was expensive and uncertain. The crown often relied on contractors, local elites, or municipalities to collect taxes in exchange for fixed payments or privileges. These arrangements could provide predictable revenue to the crown in the short term, but they could also reduce long-term yields and foster local resistance and corruption. In the colonial context, similar issues existed. Officials and merchants interacted in ways that could blur the line between legal and illicit trade. The crown's attempts at tighter control could increase administrative cost and provoke evasion. Again, silver did not eliminate these frictions. It intensified the stakes. The colonial link also included the fact that much of what the colonies needed came from global trade that was itself paid for in silver. Spanish America imported European goods through legal fleets and through contraband. It also imported African enslaved labor through systems that the crown regulated and taxed, including contracts known as asientos de negros granted to suppliers at different times. This meant that colonial economies were integrated into Atlantic and European commercial circuits where silver was both a product and a payment medium. When the crown increased demands on colonial treasuries, it could reduce local liquidity, which could affect mining, wages, and procurement. When colonial production slowed, less bullion moved, which strained the metropolitan fiscal system. The connection was a feedback loop, not a one-way drain. The strategic dimension tightened that loop. Naval war threatened shipping. Protecting fleets required ships, crews, and naval stores, many of which were sourced through international markets. Those markets often demanded payment in reliable specie or in bills drawn on reliable financial centers. The monarchy's ability to keep fleets moving, therefore, depended partly on the very credit system that depended on fleets moving. When war intensified, both costs and risks rose. Under those conditions, the crown's short-term borrowing needs rose exactly when its revenue streams became most uncertain. In the late 16th century, the war in the Low Countries was a long drain with expensive peaks. The crown needed to maintain the Army of Flanders, to pay for fortifications, and to sustain supply lines. Moving troops and money through Europe often relied on routes and agreements that could be disrupted by hostile forces. A breakdown in the movement of funds could translate into military weakness. That urgency explains why the crown paid high effective costs for short-term loans. It also explains why lenders could extract favorable terms. They were providing the monarch with something more than money. They were providing time, mobility, and conversion, the ability to turn future and distant revenues into present and local cash. American silver made that possible, but it also made the monarchy's problems look deceptively solvable. As long as lenders believed silver would arrive and Castilian taxes would keep being collected, they could continue to lend even after suspensions. But belief had limits. When suspensions occurred, the crown had to restructure. The famous settlement after the mid-1570s crisis, for example, involved reorganizing obligations and resetting the relationship between short-term lenders and long-term debt instruments. In effect, the crown repeatedly tried to shift obligations from the now category to the later category. That maneuver kept the system operating, but it also ensured that later budgets would be crowded. The 17th century added new complications that further linked colonial and metropolitan weakness. As European rivals expanded their naval power, Spanish shipping faced increased risk. The Dutch and English expanded overseas commerce and privateering, and their financial systems developed in ways that made war finance more flexible. Spanish Habsburg strategy had to respond, but response required money. Meanwhile, the crown faced internal political crises and rebellions that demanded troops and subsidies within the peninsula itself. When internal stability became a fiscal burden, the entire imperial budget became harder to manage. At the same time, the monarchy's ability to reform its fiscal structure was constrained. The composite nature of the monarchy limited uniform reform. Attempts to spread the tax burden more evenly across territories encountered legal and political resistance. Attempts to reduce dependence on Genoese or other foreign lenders had limited success because the international transfer problem remained. Someone needed to move money to where armies were. Attempts to tighten colonial extraction risked damaging the production base. Attempts to cut military commitments risked strategic collapse. This combination is the deeper meaning of why it kept producing crises. The system's moving parts could be adjusted at the margins, but the architecture stayed the same. To understand how tightly colonies were bound to the mainland problem, it helps to focus on timing and earmarking. Much of the crown's revenue was assigned in advance. Certain taxes serviced certain juros. Certain incoming revenues were pledged to repay certain asientos. If the fleet arrived late, the assigned revenue arrived late. If it arrived short, the assigned revenue was short. Yet expenditures, especially military, could not simply be delayed without consequences. Therefore, even in years of substantial total income, the crown could be illiquid. It could have resources but not cash at the right moment. That is the classic condition under which governments default on short-term obligations, while still possessing large long-term capacity. Colonial treasuries also had their own earmarking and obligations. In Spanish America, the crown's officials managed local revenues, customs, sales taxes, mining taxes, and other sources that funded local administration, defense, and church-related expenditures under royal patronage. Only part could be remitted as surplus. In emergencies, the crown could demand extraordinary remittances, but these were negotiated through colonial institutions and could create local strain. Moreover, the physical movement of remittances required secure transport across long distances. The very act of moving bullion could be costly and risky, and it required administrative procedures that slowed the flow. The monarchy tried to manage these constraints through information and paperwork. Cargo registers, shipping manifests, tax accounts, and correspondence between councils in Madrid and officials overseas. But information moved no faster than ships. Delays in receiving accurate figures could lead to optimistic planning and then sudden shortfalls. Lenders and officials alike operated with partial knowledge. That uncertainty increased the value of conservative financial behavior. Except the monarchy could not be conservative, because its strategic posture forced it into repeated high spending. The result was a pattern recognizable across decades. When war pressure rose, the crown contracted more asientos and pledged more revenue. If revenues arrived as expected, the system could function, though at high cost. If revenues faltered, the crown fell behind and suspended payments, forcing conversion of claims into longer-term instruments or renegotiated schedules. After settlement, war needs continued, so borrowing resumed. Over time, the accumulated load of debt service reduced flexibility, making each new shock harder to absorb. American silver helped the crown survive repeated shocks, but it did not eliminate the cycle, because it did not eliminate the underlying mismatch between commitments and the politically and administratively constrained ability to raise revenue quickly and uniformly. One way to see the colonies as part of the problem rather than the solution is to observe that silver inflows could encourage strategic overreach. With a perceived extra stream, the monarchy could commit to expensive policies, confident that bullion would cover gaps. Lenders, seeing the bullion, were willing to finance. This could sustain an imperial scale that might otherwise have contracted earlier. But sustaining scale is not the same as stabilizing finances. If the commitments grow in response to resources, the basic pressure remains. The colonies, in that sense, became integrated into a fiscal military machine whose appetite could expand as its fuel supply expanded. At the same time, colonial wealth did not automatically translate into productive investment in Castile that could broaden the tax base. A significant portion of spending went into immediate military costs and into purchases from abroad. When silver is used to buy foreign goods and services, it can support a war effort without building domestic production capacity. That does not mean Spain produced nothing or that all silver leaked out. But it does mean the fiscal benefits were not always compounded into greater future revenue. If the domestic economy stagnates or fails to expand in taxable productivity, then the state becomes more dependent on extraordinary levies and credit to sustain the same level of commitments. By the later 17th century, the fiscal pressures were compounded by long-term demographic and economic strains, and by the cumulative costs of decades of war. The monarchy continued to rely on debt instruments and on reorganizations. Under Charles II, the financial system faced continued difficulty, and the political consequences of fiscal weakness interacted with diplomatic vulnerability, setting conditions that would later make succession a major European crisis. But even before that point, the essential mechanics were already visible. The empire's overseas bullion was foundational to the system, yet the system's structure ensured that bullion would be absorbed into debt service, war logistics, and international payments, leaving the monarchy repeatedly exposed to the timing and credibility problems that produce fiscal crises. One way to make the system visible is to follow one unit of metal as it became one unit of military capability. Because the Spanish Habsburg crisis was rarely about total wealth in the abstract, it was about whether obligations could be met in the right currency, in the right place, at the right moment. Begin in the highlands of the Viceroyalty of Peru, where the scale of mining that developed around Potosí after the 1540s depended on inputs that were never purely local. Ore could be abundant, but refining capacity depended on mercury, and the major Andean mercury source at Huancavelica only entered large-scale production in the 1560s. When mercury became available in quantity, amalgamation methods could be adopted more broadly in the Andes in the early 1570s, changing output possibilities in a way that quickly mattered to the royal treasury, to merchants, and to European lenders. The metal itself then had to move through a chain of administration before it ever approached the Atlantic. There were taxes and fees at production, and at minting, there were officials whose work created the paperwork that distinguished what was registered from what was not. There were local treasuries that paid local costs. There were merchants and carriers who moved bullion and coin through difficult terrain to ports. And there were port officials who had to accept it into the legal trade system. Even in ideal conditions, this took time, and the time was not measured in days. It was measured in seasons. From the Pacific side, much of Peru's formal connection to the Atlantic route ran through Panama. Silver and coin moved by ship up the Pacific coast to the isthmus, crossed overland, and then continued from the Caribbean side toward the main Atlantic routes. In New Spain, large silver districts developed with their own internal routes, and the crucial point for the monarchy was that none of these flows were simply the crown's money. They were a mixture of royal revenue, private remittances, and commercial capital. The crown's share could be large, but it was embedded in a broader flow that had to remain profitable enough for miners, refiners, transporters, and merchants to keep the system moving. When policy tightened too far, it could lower the very activity that generated taxable output. Once bullion entered the transatlantic channel, it was pulled into a second machine, the monopoly and convoy structure overseen through the institutions of Castile. The House of Trade in Seville, established in 1503, and the associated merchant institutions and courts were meant to regulate the flow of people and goods, register cargoes, and collect duties. The convoy system was meant to reduce the risk of capture and to concentrate oversight. But concentration produced choke points. If convoys were delayed by war, storms, ship shortages, disease in port, or the simple problem of assembling cargoes and paperwork across an empire, then the crown's expected revenues were delayed too. That delay mattered because the monarchy's spending schedule, especially military spending, did not wait for paperwork. Now shift the scene from ports and registry offices to the daily mechanics of war in Northern Europe. The Army of Flanders, which became one of the great long-term expenses of the monarchy, had a basic, recurring need: regular pay and regular supply. Without pay, soldiers became a political and military liability, because arrears could trigger mutiny, desertion, looting, and a breakdown in the fragile relationship between an occupying army and local society. Supply was equally complex. An army did not consume only bread and meat. It consumed transport services, horses, wagons, fodder, weapons, shot, powder, clothing, and the contracted labor that kept fortifications and roads usable. Those supplies were purchased through networks of contractors, towns, and middlemen. Some costs could be shifted onto allies or occupied territories, but that too had limits. If extraction became too heavy, it produced resistance, flight, and a collapse of local compliance that increased costs later. In other words, the army's finances were themselves a system of bargaining and coercion, and a lack of cash made the system harder to manage. Here the monarchy encountered a practical issue that shaped everything. Paying an army in the Low Countries required money in the Low Countries. The crown could not simply pile coin in Seville and expect the army of Flanders to be stable. Funds had to be moved and converted, and early modern Europe did not have a state-owned banking system capable of doing this on demand. The crown therefore relied on contracts with financiers who could advance funds where needed and be repaid elsewhere. This is the operational meaning of the asientos. A lender might provide a large advance in one financial center, arrange transfer through bills of exchange, and then be repaid out of specific taxes or out of expected bullion receipts. The crown was buying not only credit but logistics, an ability to translate distant and future resources into immediate funds near the front. That translation created a second kind of timing risk. Even if a fleet arrived safely, the conversion of bullion into usable payments depended on negotiations and settlements with lenders, merchants, and officials. When the monarchy was heavily indebted, the arrival of a large shipment could trigger a rush of claims that consumed the cash before it stabilized anything. When bullion arrived late, the crown's repayment schedules could fail. And when repayment schedules failed, the whole transfer mechanism could freeze. A financier who suspected that repayment would be delayed might stop advancing. If several did so at once, the crown's liquidity crisis could become immediate, and the Army of Flanders would feel it within weeks, not years. This is why the sequence of Philip II's payment suspensions matters as more than a list of dates. The suspensions of 1557 and 1560 occurred early in the reign and reflected a structural inheritance. Large debts already accumulated, and a fiscal structure still trying to adapt to imperial scale. In those early decades, the monarchy's ambitions were not hypothetical. They were tied to active commitments in Italy, the Low Countries, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. The American silver flow was growing, but it was not yet a mature and predictable pipeline. The Crown therefore leaned hard on credit. When the credit could no longer be serviced on schedule, the Crown suspended payment on certain obligations and forced a renegotiation. Those episodes were the first clear signs that the monarchy's war machine, its domestic tax base, and its colonial revenues did not line up in a stable way. The most instructive crisis in terms of mechanism is the mid-1570s, because by then the American silver pipeline was larger, and the Crown's reliance on international financiers was deeply embedded. In 1575, Philip II's government suspended payments on contracts with Genoese bankers. What followed was not simply anger in counting houses. It was a disruption of interlocking credit relationships inside Castile itself, because large bankers were connected to domestic lending and to the wider commercial system. When major lenders stopped receiving payments, their ability and willingness to extend new credit declined. The Crown, which was already borrowing to bridge timing gaps, found that the bridge itself was collapsing. A system that depended on continuous short-term refinancing found itself abruptly constrained. That is why these crises could be sudden even when the monarchy still possessed long-term resources. When the credit mechanism froze, the monarchy had to improvise. One tool was to increase pressure on Castile. Another was to convert obligations into longer-term debt, shifting immediate claims into juros assigned to specific taxes. This could stabilize relationships with some creditors by giving them legally recognized claims on revenue streams. But it also increased the volume of revenue already pledged for years ahead. The more revenue that was pre-assigned to debt service, the less flexible the Crown became. In effect, the Crown would regain room to breathe in the short term by tightening a long-term constraint. At the same time, the colonial system did not pause in response to a European financial crisis. Mines continued to produce, administrators continued to register, and fleets continued to be prepared. But the Crown's ability to use the incoming bullion as free money was reduced by the fact that creditors' claims were now closely tied to those arrivals. The fleet became not just a fiscal resource but a moving collateral. When lenders believed that an incoming fleet was already spoken for, they could demand priority. When lenders believed the fleet might be delayed, they could demand higher costs, better security, or refuse to advance at all. The colonial pipeline thus became a source of bargaining power for lenders and a source of vulnerability for the Crown. The 1590s show the same pattern under heavier strategic strain. By 1596, Philip II's government again suspended payments. This was the late phase of a long reign marked by sustained war costs, and by then the debt load and the long-term assignment of taxes were deeply entrenched. The basic structure remained. Castile's fiscal engine was heavily mortgaged. The monarchy still had multi-theater commitments, and colonial silver, though significant, arrived on schedules and through risks that could not be perfectly controlled. The Crown's financial management was therefore an ongoing exercise in triage, deciding which obligations could be delayed, which could be paid to keep armies and fleets functional, and which creditors had to be brought back into cooperation through settlements. With Philip III, the system did not reset. In 1607, the government declared a moratorium on debts. By that point, the monarchy had decades of institutional habit behind it, a reliance on short-term contracts to bridge cash needs, and a reliance on long-term debt instruments to absorb and restructure those short-term shocks. The colonial connection remained the same in basic form, but it had broadened into a wider Atlantic economy in which silver was also moving through private and commercial channels that were not fully subject to state command. A monarchy could regulate, tax, and police, but it could not eliminate smuggling, evasive reporting, or the market incentives that drew metal toward profitable routes. This meant that American silver was not one pile of money in a royal warehouse. It was a stream dispersed through merchants' hands, treasury accounts, private remittances, and international exchanges. The crown intercepted a portion of it through taxes and duties, and by borrowing against anticipated arrivals. That interception could be large and still be insufficient. Under Philip IV, the problem became sharper because the monarchy's strategic environment became more demanding at the same time. The financial architecture became more brittle. Renewed warfare in the early 17th century increased costs. A major suspension in 1627 illustrates the persistent dependence on credit and the difficulty of meeting obligations under sustained pressure. The monarchy faced the need to fund armies and fleets while trying to manage a domestic tax structure already strained, and a colonial pipeline that remained subject to shipping risk and administrative friction. It is also here that the internal diversity of the monarchy becomes impossible to ignore. Castile remained the main payer because its institutions were more directly available to the crown. Other territories had their own fiscal privileges and bargaining structures. When the monarchy sought to broaden the base, it ran into political constraints. Attempts to secure larger contributions from territories that had long defended their privileges could produce conflict, and conflict itself carried costs. When the monarchy's leaders pushed harder, they risked destabilizing the internal order they needed for revenue extraction. Thus, the fiscal problem was not only accounting, it was constitutional in the early modern sense. It was about what the crown could legally and politically demand. The colonies entered that constitutional landscape in a different way. Overseas dominions were governed through viceroys, audiencias, and a lattice of legal institutions that produced paperwork and procedure, but also spaces for negotiation and evasion. Colonial officials were agents of the crown, yet they were also embedded in local networks of patronage and commerce. Their incentives did not always align with Madrid's immediate fiscal needs. This meant that increasing remittances from colonial treasuries was not a simple order. It was an administrative campaign that required compliance through appointments, inspections, legal enforcement, and often compromises with local power holders. Those measures took time. They were not well suited to sudden European liquidity crises that demanded cash within weeks. The labor and supply systems of colonial mining also imposed constraints on extraction. Large Andean production drew on coercive labor drafts and local obligations that were politically sensitive and operationally complex. Mexican mining relied more heavily on wage labor markets and on local arrangements that still depended on a steady availability of mercury and capital. In both cases, mining required credit and supplies. If colonial treasuries were drained too aggressively, or if merchants and miners expected unstable policy, investment could slow. Lower investment could mean lower output later. The crown therefore faced a problem that resembles a modern state's dilemma with productive tax bases. The most productive sector is also the one you cannot destroy without losing the future. This is also where the silver did not stay mechanism becomes more concrete, because the colonies were not only producing silver, they were consuming imported goods and services paid for in silver, and those imports included elements central to the colonial economy's continuation. Mining centers needed tools, food, animals, textiles, and sometimes specialized inputs. Colonial towns and bureaucracies needed paper, ink, books, cloth, metal goods, and a constant movement of merchants. The legally regulated system tried to channel this through authorized fleets and ports, but demand created incentives for alternative channels. The more that legal trade was constrained by bottlenecks, the more that contraband became attractive to both sellers and buyers. Contraband reduced the taxable base and undermined the very fiscal expectations on which metropolitan borrowing often rested. Thus, when the crown tightened control to secure revenue, it could inadvertently increase the share of trade moving outside control. The war environment intensified that dynamic. War increased the demand for bullion in Europe because armies and navies consumed supplies purchased in international markets. War also increased the risk to shipping. That risk could delay fleets and reduce predictable arrivals. When risk rose, the crown's cost of borrowing against the next fleet rose too. In effect, war made bullion more necessary and less dependable at the same time. That is a recipe for crisis in any system reliant on timing. To keep the flow alive, it helps to imagine the monarchy's finances as multiple ledgers layered on top of one another. One ledger is the annual collection of taxes in Castile, the expected yields from consumption taxes, customs duties, and negotiated services. Another is the ledger of debt service, the scheduled payments on juros, already tied to specific taxes. Another is the ledger of short-term contracts, asientos that must be honored to keep transfers working. Another is the ledger of colonial expectations, projected bullion arrivals, duties, and remittances from colonial treasuries. Another is the ledger of military schedules, pay dates, provisioning contracts, shipbuilding timetables, and emergency expenses triggered by campaigns. The Spanish Habsburg money problem was the chronic failure to make these ledgers align without recurring breaks. When alignment failed, the consequences could be operational. An army might go unpaid. Contractors might refuse to supply. A fleet might be delayed because supplies were not secured. A financier might refuse to advance because repayment prospects were unclear. These are the mundane mechanisms that connect a silver mine in the Andes to a mutiny in Northern Europe. The connection is not poetic. It is administrative and logistical. The monarchy developed routines to manage these risks. It did not simply stumble from crisis to crisis without learning. Officials tried to schedule borrowing around expected arrivals. They tried to earmark certain streams to reassure lenders. They tried to diversify lenders and negotiate terms. They tried to adjust taxes. They tried to manage fleet protection. But each routine had costs. Earmarking reassured lenders but reduced flexibility. Increasing taxes raised revenue but also increased resistance and could depress economic activity. Delaying fleets for protection reduced the risk of capture but increased the risk of fiscal delay. Issuing more juros could stabilize immediate relations but expanded long-term commitments. In every case, the solution to one problem tended to worsen another. In the long 17th century, the costs of maintaining the imperial posture, combined with internal strain and changing European power balances, made the system more fragile. When the monarchy faced major internal rebellions and multiple simultaneous wars, fiscal strain became more than a budget issue. It became a governance issue. The state's ability to perform basic functions depended on its ability to pay. And because much of that ability was mediated by credit, trust became a central asset. Every suspension of payments damaged trust, even if lenders returned later. Trust could be repaired through settlements, but repair usually required concessions that tightened long-term constraints. Colonial silver continued to matter through all of this, but in a way that often confuses later observers. It mattered less as a permanent cure and more as a continuous enabler. It allowed the monarchy to sustain commitments longer than it might otherwise have managed. It allowed lenders to believe that a serially strained monarchy remained lendable. It allowed the crown to keep finding liquidity after each settlement. In that sense, silver prolonged the life of the system. But the same silver, because it could be pledged and repledged, became part of the mechanism that increased leverage and crowded future revenues. The crown could borrow against next year's arrivals, then borrow against the year after that, and then face the moment when too many promises were stacked against too few flexible streams. If we keep following the money circuit at a finer grain, the next step is to map the transfer channels more explicitly. How bullion arrivals in Iberian ports intersected with the contracts of financiers who could route value into northern Europe. How those routes depended on political geography and secure corridors. How interruptions, whether by war at sea, by political disruption on land, or by credit freezes, translated into arrears and military instability. The Spanish Habsburg system did not collapse because one ship sank or one tax failed. It stumbled because it depended on many moving parts all functioning at once, repeatedly, over decades. And the colonies were not a distant appendix to that process. They were one of the main engines inside it, producing the metal that both underwrote the monarchy's borrowing and exposed it to the timing and credibility risks that borrowing created. To see the transfer channels more explicitly, it helps to separate three movements that were often conflated in political language, but were distinct in practice. First, there was the movement of metal inside the Americas from mining districts to mints and treasuries, and then to the principal export ports. Second, there was the Atlantic movement under convoy protection, with its own scheduling and wartime constraints. Third, there was the movement of value inside Europe, which often did not mean wagons of coin crossing borders so much as bills of exchange, credit settlements, and the timed delivery of cash in specific places for specific purposes. The Spanish Habsburg financial system was strongest when these three movements reinforced each other, and weakest when they fell out of sequence. In New Spain, a typical legal route for silver and minted coin ran from interior mining zones through commercial hubs toward Veracruz, the principal Atlantic port for the Mexico route. In the Viceroyalty of Peru, large volumes moved toward ports connected to the Isthmus route, with the crossing at Panama linking Pacific and Caribbean coasts. These were not only shipping routes, they were administrative corridors. Moving bullion legally required documentation, inspection, and fees. It also required security. Caravans and mule trains carrying high-value cargo were attractive targets, and security itself had costs that were ultimately paid out of the commercial margins of the metal trade. Every cost along the way reduced what could be remitted as surplus to Iberia, unless someone else absorbed the loss through lower profits or lower wages, and those reductions could feed back into production and compliance. When bullion reached the Caribbean side, it entered a world built around assembly. The legal trade system of the Spanish Atlantic was designed to funnel shipping through a limited number of authorized ports and to concentrate departures and arrivals into convoys. In practice, the convoys were usually discussed as fleets, but the fiscal point was that they created a rhythm. Goods and silver gathered for departure. A convoy formed when conditions allowed. A protected transit was made, and then cargoes and duties were processed at the metropolitan end. If the rhythm held, credit could be structured around it. If the rhythm slipped, the entire European side of the system had to adjust. On the Iberian end, the key institution for the early period was the Casa de Contratación in Seville, created in 1503 to supervise and regulate trade with the Indies. Its remit covered licensing, registration, disputes, navigation oversight in certain functions, and crucially for the Treasury, the procedures that made transatlantic trade legible and taxable to Castilian institutions. Seville's river access shaped how this system worked in practice, and over time the operative center of Atlantic trade shifted toward Cadiz, but the deeper point remained. Trade was made to pass through a few administrative gates so that the crown could claim duties and enforce a monopoly framework. Those gates created revenue, but they also created pressure for evasion and created single points of failure when war, disease, weather, or political crisis disrupted normal operation. Once bullion and coin entered metropolitan circulation, it faced a fork. Some was drawn directly into royal revenues and payments. Much was drawn into private commerce and then into the fiscal system through taxation and lending. For the monarchy, the decisive issue was not simply obtaining silver, but turning it into usable payments for imperial obligations that were often outside Iberia. The core European challenge was transfer. To keep armies operating in the Low Countries or to fund military needs in Italy and the Mediterranean, the monarchy needed cash in the right theater. Even if the crown possessed coin in Castile, physically moving it was risky, slow, and expensive, and it could be blocked by hostile territories. The monarchy therefore relied on financial techniques that moved value through paper claims and settlement networks. This is where the asientos must be understood as logistical contracts, not merely as loans. A typical asiento could involve an agreement with a financier or syndicate to provide a sum in a designated place, often near the theater of war, while repayment might be made in Castile, sometimes in the form of rights to receive money from specific taxes, sometimes by delivery of bullion or by conversion into juros. The financier would often use bills of exchange to transfer value across space. The financier's ability to do this depended on networks of correspondence, credibility in multiple markets, and access to cash where the crown needed it. This created a structural dependence. The monarchy's military machine leaned on private financial networks to perform the essential state function of paying troops abroad. The Genoese prominence in this system in the later 16th century was not an accident of personal relationships, but a product of network geography. Genoa was tied into Mediterranean commerce and European finance and had deep ties to Habsburg Italian territories, including the Duchy of Milan, which was strategically positioned. In the European north, Antwerp and other commercial centers mattered as nodes where exchange could be arranged. Through these nodes, value could be shifted without requiring the crown to escort wagons of coin across hostile space. But the same structure meant that a payment suspension in Madrid could become a shock in financial centers far from Castile, precisely because the crown's contracts were embedded in private networks that also financed commerce. The movement of troops and supplies had its own geography that ran in parallel with money movement. The overland corridor, often known as the Spanish Road, linking the Habsburg sphere in Italy to the Low Countries, was a strategic route for moving soldiers and sometimes funds through friendly or negotiated territories. Maintaining such corridors required diplomacy, subsidies, and reliable cash. Even when soldiers could be marched, their pay could not be marched as easily. Cash still had to appear at appointed locations. The monarchy therefore faced a recurring need for synchronized logistics. Movement of men, movement of supplies, and movement of money had to be coordinated, and any break in one could disrupt the others. A chronic problem was that the monarchy's European expenditure schedules were partially endogenous to war. War created emergencies that could not be predicted on the same calendar as tax collection or fleet arrivals. A siege could require sudden extra payments to contractors. A naval campaign could require sudden purchases of stores. An allied ruler might require subsidy on short notice to keep an alliance intact. In such cases, the crown did what early modern states often did. It promised future revenue to obtain immediate resources. The mechanism was rational in the short run, but repeated use of it hardened into structure. That structure is visible in the way juros accumulated. Juros were often secured on specific taxes, and their holders expected regular payment. When the crown issued more juros, it was not simply increasing an abstract debt. It was assigning more of its future tax stream to fixed obligations. This created a crowding effect. The portion of annual revenue that could be used for new needs shrank as more was pre-committed. The crown then became more reliant on extraordinary taxes and on short-term borrowing to meet ordinary operations. The more it relied on short-term borrowing, the more exposed it became to disruptions in credit. This helps explain why American silver could coincide with serial payment crises. Silver increased the total volume of resources flowing through the monarchy's fiscal and commercial systems, but it did not automatically increase the uncommitted share of revenue available for discretionary use. In many years, new arrivals were already pledged implicitly or explicitly to service existing obligations. The crown could celebrate an arrival and still face an immediate shortfall because a significant portion of that metal would be absorbed by debt service and by the demands of lenders who had advanced money earlier. The metal did not behave like a reserve that accumulated. It behaved like a stream that was quickly claimed. The millions tax voted in Castile in 1590 shows the domestic side of this process. It was an attempt to raise additional revenue through taxes on consumption goods, negotiated through the Castilian Cortes. Its very form signals the crown's predicament. It needed a revenue source large enough to matter, but politically feasible within the bargaining structure of Castile. Consumption taxes could be made to yield substantial sums, but they also fell broadly across society and could provoke resistance and economic distortion. They were also visible in daily life, making them politically costly. Yet as the crown's long-term revenues became more heavily assigned to juros, the need for new streams became constant. The millions tax was not a one-off anomaly so much as a symptom of structural dependency on extraordinary and indirect revenue. Now return to the colonies and observe how their internal institutions shaped what the metropolis could expect. Spanish America was governed through large administrative units, including viceroyalties and audiencias, and through municipal councils and ecclesiastical structures under royal patronage. These institutions collected revenue locally and paid for local government, defense, and administrative salaries. Royal revenue in the Americas was therefore not an undifferentiated pile. It was distributed across treasuries with their own obligations. When Madrid demanded remittances, it was not only extracting, it was reallocating, sometimes forcing local treasuries to postpone local payments. In a mining economy, delays in payment could matter because production depended on credit and on the steady purchase of inputs and labor. A treasury drained too hard could produce a contraction that reduced the longer-run flow. The mercury factor shows how tight the linkage could be. The adoption of mercury amalgamation at Potosí in the early 1570s, facilitated by mercury supply from Huancavelica and other sources, helped drive a surge in Andean output. But mercury supply itself required administrative and logistical coordination. Mercury had to be mined, refined, transported, and distributed. Disruption in mercury supply could reduce silver output and therefore reduce tax revenue and remittances. This meant that the crown's fiscal health was indirectly tied to the functioning of a hazardous extractive industry in the Andes, and to the ability to move a key input through long supply chains. It was an empire-wide industrial dependency, not a simple extraction relationship. Even when output was strong, not all bullion went to Spain. Part remained in the Americas for local circulation, and substantial quantities moved through private channels for commerce. This was not an anomaly. It was necessary for an economy in which silver coins served as a medium of exchange and store of value. Merchants used silver to buy imports. Mine owners used silver to pay labor and suppliers. Local governments and churches collected and spent in silver. The crown's fiscal share was extracted through taxes and duties, but the crown's ability to increase that share was limited by the need to keep the wider system functioning. Over-extraction risked reducing compliance and production. Under-extraction left Madrid short. The monarchy lived inside this tension for generations. The convoy system added a further constraint. It shaped the legal cadence of remittances. If the legal fleets were delayed, legal remittances were delayed. Merchants then had incentive to use alternative routes, increasing the share of trade outside official control. But the crown's borrowing and repayment schedules were often structured around expected legal arrivals, precisely because those arrivals were documented and therefore could be pledged. This produced a strategic irony. The more the crown depended on predictable, documented arrivals to reassure lenders, the more it relied on a system that created bottlenecks and encouraged evasion. As evasion grew, the documented base that could be pledged shrank relative to total trade, increasing the crown's reliance on pressure, enforcement, and additional borrowing. When the system entered a crisis phase, the effects often appeared first in Europe, but were rooted in this global chain. A payment suspension in Madrid could cause a sudden halt in lending. The halt in lending could disrupt transfers to the Army of Flanders. The disruption in transfers could cause arrears. Arrears could contribute to mutiny or to the refusal of contractors to supply. When contractors refused, the crown might need emergency purchases at worse terms, increasing costs. Increased costs required more borrowing. More borrowing required stronger collateral, often tied to future revenues, including colonial receipts. The crown therefore tightened its claims on future arrivals. This could increase pressure on colonial treasuries and on the trade system, encouraging more evasion and straining production. The feedback loop tightened. It is also important to see that the crown's fiscal problem was not a single uniform Spanish problem. Castile was deeply entangled with the imperial credit system because its taxes were the principal collateral. That meant that a fiscal crisis in Madrid was often, in practice, a crisis in the Castilian fiscal engine. Other parts of the monarchy were implicated differently. The Low Countries were central to expenditure and to strategic goals, but the war there also disrupted local revenue and made fiscal cooperation harder. Italian territories provided strategic depth and resources, but were not a limitless fiscal reservoir. The Aragonese realms maintained strong privileges that limited extraction. The monarchy's inability to make its fiscal structure uniform meant that it could not easily spread burdens in a way that reduced stress on Castile. That structural feature pushed it repeatedly toward the same solution set: squeeze Castile, borrow against expected arrivals, and renegotiate when the squeeze and borrowing reached their limits. By the mid-17th century, the pattern had become a kind of institutional habit, and habit itself can be a constraint. Once a state has built routines around short-term borrowing and long-term assignment of revenue, it becomes difficult to stop without either cutting commitments sharply or building a new revenue structure that takes time and political capital to create. The Spanish Habsburg monarchy had limited ability to do either, especially under the pressure of continuous warfare and internal political strain. So the system persisted, surviving through cycles of crisis and settlement. If we choose a few crisis points and follow the chain from American production to European payment, the repeating structure becomes easier to see without reducing everything to a single cause. The monarchy's finances were not a mystery to contemporaries. They were an administrative reality made difficult by distance, by the legal fragmentation of the composite monarchy, and by the fact that the largest obligations of the crown were increasingly payable outside the place where the crown's most workable tax base could be tapped. A typical cycle began with forecasts. Officials and contractors in Madrid, Seville, and other fiscal nodes estimated what would arrive from the Indies and when, alongside what Castilian taxes could yield in the coming months. Those estimates were never purely technical. They were shaped by war conditions, by the shipping situation, and by what could be negotiated domestically in Castile. But once the estimates existed, they became the basis for contracts. A banker who agreed to advance money for an army did so with an eye on the crown's future cash streams, especially those streams that were visible, documentable, and assignable. This visibility is one reason the formal convoy system mattered so much. A registered arrival was easier to pledge than a dispersed commercial flow. The same logic applied to Castilian taxes assigned to juros. Predictable streams could be pledged, and pledges could be turned into present cash through new borrowing. From there, the money moved, often in paper form. The financier advanced funds where needed, commonly in places linked to military supply in northern Europe, and sought repayment through designated channels in Iberia. The crown obtained what it most needed: the ability to pay soldiers and suppliers in the theater where force was being maintained. But the crown paid for this capacity with high effective costs and with increased dependence on the willingness of private networks to keep performing transfers. If confidence held and revenue arrived as expected, the system functioned in the sense that armies stayed operational. If confidence failed or revenue arrived late, the system could seize. This seizure is visible in the way payment suspensions worked. The crown did not typically stop trying to spend when it suspended payments. It continued to spend where it judged spending was essential, while stopping or delaying payments to creditors under certain contracts. The purpose was to force a settlement, to take claims that were immediately due and push them into a longer form. The most common instrument for that longer form was the juro, because it could be anchored to a designated tax stream. For the creditor, this was sometimes preferable to total loss, because it created a legally recognized claim. For the crown, it restored immediate liquidity by converting now payments into later payments. But each conversion increased the portion of annual revenue already spoken for. The system's future became more rigid after every settlement. That rigidity fed back into the colonial connection in a very specific way. Over time, arrivals from the Indies became less like discretionary windfalls and more like pledged collateral in an ongoing cycle of refinancing. A large bullion arrival could no longer be treated as a reserve to accumulate, because it was absorbed into the settlement of past advances and the servicing of assigned obligations. When officials in Spain spoke as though silver would rescue the monarchy, they were speaking in the language of total volume. The fiscal machine, however, operated in the language of timing and earmarks. Much of the volume was already pre-allocated by the time it arrived. The overseas system could not be redesigned quickly enough to solve this. Mining output depended on conditions that could be encouraged and managed but not commanded at will. Availability and distribution of mercury, labor regimes and labor markets, transport safety, and the functioning of local credit and supply chains. Colonial treasuries, meanwhile, had their own obligations. They financed administration, defense, salaries, and local procurement. When extraordinary remittances were demanded, they could be raised, but the process had consequences, and it was rarely instantaneous. Even if metal was available, moving it to the coast, assembling it into a protected shipping schedule, and completing the paperwork that made it legible to Castilian fiscal institutions took time. The monarchy's European cash needs, by contrast, could become urgent overnight. The war environment made the mismatch more persistent. Sea power and privateering threats increased the cost and risk of moving bullion and goods. Protective measures, larger convoys, delayed sailings, rerouting, could reduce capture risk but increase timing uncertainty. Timing uncertainty raised the effective cost of borrowing because lenders demanded compensation for the chance that repayment would be delayed. Higher borrowing costs increased the rate at which revenue streams were pledged. More pledging meant less flexibility, which increased dependence on borrowing in the next emergency. The feedback loop did not require catastrophic losses. It could intensify through ordinary delays and ordinary wartime frictions. By the 17th century, the fiscal system's endurance rested less on the notion of limitless silver and more on the monarchy's capacity to keep negotiating with Castile for taxes and services, negotiating with lenders for advances and settlements, negotiating with territorial elites for cooperation, and negotiating with colonial administrations for remittances, while maintaining the productive base that generated those remittances. This was governance by continuous bargaining, and it was expensive in both money and political capital. The same structure helps clarify why the monarchy could appear simultaneously powerful and constrained. It could field armies across Europe, maintain garrisons, and operate fleets for decades, which was not the behavior of a state without resources. Yet it repeatedly reached points at which it could not meet contractual payments on schedule. The core contradiction is resolved when the system is viewed as a chain rather than a warehouse. The monarchy commanded large flows, but the flows moved through narrow channels with fixed rhythms. When obligations multiplied across theaters and revenue was fragmented across jurisdictions and already pledged streams, the state's problem became less about total wealth than about the moment-to-moment alignment of multiple ledgers. Over the long run, the consequences were cumulative. As more Castilian revenue was tied up in debt service, discretionary capacity narrowed. Domestic taxation could be expanded only through political negotiation and at the cost of resistance and economic strain. Overseas extraction could be pushed, but only within limits set by production, compliance, and the need to keep colonial economies functioning. The European credit system could be tapped repeatedly, but every suspension and settlement altered terms, reputations, and the cost of future advances. The monarchy's financial management, therefore, became an ongoing process of sustaining a large imperial posture by constantly converting future resources into present spending, and then managing the damage that conversion caused to future budgets. By the end of the Spanish Habsburg line in 1700, the fiscal structure they had relied upon for generations had not disappeared, but it had shown its limits repeatedly under the strain of long wars and the administrative realities of an empire spanning oceans. The American silver that had once seemed to promise effortless solvency had, in practice, been folded into an expanding machinery of debt service, transfer costs, and wartime logistics. The colonies were not a separate story from the mainland's financial troubles. They were one of the main sources of the monarchy's usable resources, and also one of the main reasons its finances could never be managed as a simple domestic budget. The empire's wealth arrived through long, vulnerable channels, and the monarchy's obligations came due in places and on schedules those channels could not reliably match. The Spanish Habsburg money problem in the end was not that silver was absent. It was that silver entered a system whose commitments, legal structure, and credit dependence ensured that each arrival was already entangled in past promises and future needs. The monarchy's ability to keep operating depended on that entanglement holding together, year after year, across oceans and across multiple jurisdictions. When it held, armies were paid and fleets sailed. When it slipped, payments were suspended, debts were reorganized, and the next cycle began with an even tighter set of constraints.